In the February twilight of 1943, a heavy, almost palpable silence hung over the snow-covered swamps of the Northwestern Front. For hundreds of kilometers around, icy wastelands stretched, interspersed with impassable forests and frost-bound bogs, which at any moment could turn into a trap. Soldiers, pressed to the cold ground, listened to the booming rumble of distant artillery, understanding that silence was merely a prelude to something grand and terrifying. In headquarters, deep underground, by the light of kerosene lamps, officers bent over maps where red arrows of the offensive looked clear and decisive, promising an imminent triumph. But here, on the front line, reality felt different. Through the biting wind and icy grit that struck their faces, the enormous war machine stood frozen, awaiting a command that was to forever change the balance of power in the northern direction. At stake was not just a tactical victory, but the complete crushing of one of the enemy's most powerful groupings, which had held the region in a vice for many months. This moment of uncertainty, when the future was yet unwritten and the past pressed with the weight of responsibility, became the starting point for an operation whose name sounded beautiful and almost poetic, but whose fate turned out to be linked with the deepest disappointment and oblivion. The success in breaking the encirclement around Leningrad in January 1943 inspired the country's highest leadership. It seemed that the initiative had completely passed into the hands of the defenders, and now was the time for a decisive blow that would leave the enemy no chance of recovery. The euphoria after the triumph on the Volga created the illusion that any obstacle could be swept away by a powerful assault. The plan, matured in the depths of the general staff, amazed with its scale. It was not just about pushing back the front line, but about encircling and completely liquidating Army Group North. The plan received a codename in honor of a celestial landmark, Polar Star. The Stavka, High Command, bet on surprise and coordinated actions of three fronts at once: Leningrad, Volkhov, and Northwestern. The coordination of this colossal force was entrusted to a man whose name was already associated with the most resounding victories: Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. He was tasked with transforming a series of local strikes into one crushing hammer that would shatter the German defenses and reach the shores of the Baltic Sea, completely cutting off enemy divisions from supply routes. Preparation for such a large-scale movement required incredible efforts in conditions that could hardly be called suitable for maneuver. The northwest of Russia is a region where geography itself is a serious adversary. Endless swamps, dense thickets, and a complete lack of normal roads turned any movement of troops into a logistical nightmare. Nevertheless, in an atmosphere of strict secrecy, hundreds of thousands of people, thousands of tanks, and artillery pieces were drawn to the front line. The supply of this gigantic organism depended on several narrow railway lines and temporary corduroy roads, which were constantly under the sights of enemy aviation. Rear officers performed the impossible, trying to provide the advancing units with ammunition and provisions, but nature began to give the first alarming signs. The winter, which was supposed to freeze the bogs for the passage of heavy equipment, suddenly began to recede. Early thaws turned the roads into a sticky mush, in which trucks bogged down and horses got stuck. But the machine had already been set in motion, and the flywheel of the offensive could not be stopped without the risk of violating the overall strategic concept of the winter campaign. The main blow was planned against the so-called Demyansk salient, a dangerous sector that the enemy had held for a long time. This area resembled the outline of a suitcase handle on the map, and it was here that the Soviet command saw an ideal opportunity to create a cauldron. The enemy troops located here were in a vulnerable position, being surrounded on 3 sides. However, the enemy was not idle either. Realizing the threat, the German command began to prepare a withdrawal plan in advance, striving to preserve manpower and avoid a repeat of the Volga catastrophe. This created a situation in which Soviet troops had to advance on positions that the enemy was about to abandon, but only to occupy even more fortified lines in the rear. Tension grew. Zhukov demanded an acceleration of the pace, understanding that time was working against them, and every day of delay gave the enemy a chance for an organized retreat and strengthening of defenses on new lines. The external conflict of this operation unfolded against the backdrop of a clash between 2 fundamentally different strategies of warfare. On one side, the desire for a large-scale encirclement embedded in the foundation of the Soviet school of deep operations. On the other, the pragmatic and flexible defense of the enemy, aimed at conserving forces and utilizing terrain advantages. When the offensive of the Northwestern Front began on February 10, 1943, it became clear that reality was far from staff calculations. The density of artillery fire was impressive, but shells often fell into emptiness or got stuck in deep snow and mud, causing no expected damage to concrete fortifications. Infantry, rising to the attack, immediately came under dagger fire from machine guns from well-camouflaged positions, which could not be suppressed due to poor visibility and terrain features. Tank brigades, called upon to become the ram of the defense, found themselves trapped on the few available roads, becoming easy prey for anti-tank artillery. The situation was complicated by the fact that the enemy began to implement its Zieten plan, a systematic withdrawal of troops from the Demyansk pocket. Instead of standing to the last and allowing themselves to be encircled, enemy units slowly and professionally retreated, leaving behind scorched earth, mined roads, and destroyed bridges. Soviet troops, instead of a decisive battle, found themselves in the role of pursuers, who were forced to break through dense rearguard screens. Every village, every nameless height turned into a fortress, the capture of which took days and thousands of lives. Logistics, already working at its limit, finally broke down. Artillery could not keep up with the infantry. Ammunition had to be delivered manually or on pack animals through forest trails, and the wounded waited for hours for evacuation, freezing in snow-covered craters. The grandeur of the Polar Star plan began to melt before their eyes, turning into a series of bloody skirmishes in the forest wilderness, where the advantage in technology was nullified by the impossibility of applying it. Internally, the conflict escalated into a personal drama for commanders and ordinary soldiers. For Zhukov, accustomed to harsh leadership methods and demanding results at any cost, this operation became a challenge to his authority. He saw his plan bogging down and, in fits of rage, accused front commanders of indecisiveness and incompetence. However, those directly on the ground faced insurmountable tasks. Orders to attack fortified positions head-on without proper artillery support caused internal protest, which, however, rarely broke out under strict discipline. Soldiers, exhausted by endless marches and constant cold, showed miracles of heroism. But this heroism was often directed at correcting planning errors. In letters home, which passed through strict censorship, weariness from uncertainty seeped through. People understood that they were advancing but did not see the decisive turning point promised by political commissars. The internal rift between the ambitions of the high command and the reality of trench life grew deeper, undermining morale even in the most resilient units. The philosophical and ideological conflict of the operation lay in the clash of two value systems in the approach to human resources. Soviet military doctrine of that period viewed losses as an inevitable price for strategic success. The belief that mass and will could overcome any material obstacles collided with a reality where modern weapons and competent defense could stop any onslaught. A paradox arose. Striving to liberate territories and save people, the command threw thousands of lives into battle under conditions that practically ruled out success. This was a conflict between abstract state interest and the value of individual existence. The idea of the polar star as a symbol of hope and a guiding light in the minds of many participants in those events began to transform into a symbol of a cold, soulless mechanism that demanded ever-new sacrifices without giving a sense of imminent victory in return. The principles of total offensive and cautious, resource-saving tactics clashed, and in this struggle, the inertia of thinking often prevailed, preventing the timely recognition of error and a change of course. The transformation of the situation occurred in mid-March 1943, when it became finally clear that the original plan had completely failed. The offensive on Staraya Russa, which was supposed to be a key element of the operation, bogged down in the spring thaw and fierce enemy resistance. Rivers opened up, turning lowlands into impassable lakes of mud. Equipment finally stalled, and the infantry, deprived of support, was forced to go on the defensive at unfavorable lines. At this moment, Zhukov and Stavka realized that the polar star would not rise. The grand design broke down into separate, unrelated episodes that could no longer lead to the encirclement of Army Group North. It was a bitter revelation. The enormous resources spent on preparation and the thousands of lives sacrificed did not yield the result expected in the Kremlin. The situation changed dramatically. Not a trace of the offensive impulse remained. It was time for agonizing analysis and the search for culprits, although the true causes of the failure lay in the very structure of planning and the underestimation of the enemy and natural factors. The culmination of events arrived when the last reserves were thrown into battle in a desperate attempt to at least partially achieve the set goals. Battles for small plots of land took on a character of extreme ferocity. Every tree in the forest, every hillock became an arena for the clash of ideas and wills. In these final attacks, all the tension of the preceding weeks manifested, the despair of those who pushed forward and the tenacity of those who defended. But this was no longer a march to victory. It was a fight for saving face, for the right to say that the offensive continued. Ultimately, the order to cease active operations became merely a formal recognition of a reality that had long been obvious to everyone on the front line. The front froze, and the roar of cannons was replaced by a silence filled with the bitterness of realizing that a grand objective remained unattainable. Army Group North held its ground, though it was forced to shorten its front line, and Soviet troops remained on the captured bridgeheads, which now had to be held at the cost of incredible effort in the conditions of the nascent spring. The significance of Operation Polar Star for modern history is hard to overestimate, although for a long time it remained in the shadow of more successful campaigns. It was a cruel but necessary lesson that even the most brilliant commander is not immune to mistakes if he ignores the objective laws of logistics and geography. The lessons of this failure taught the Soviet command a more flexible approach, forcing them to abandon the idea of a linear offensive everywhere and at once in favor of more precise and prepared strikes. Today, We see in these events a reflection of a universal human tragedy. When great ambitions collide with harsh reality, the highest price always has to be paid. It is important to understand that history is not only a series of victorious marches, but also a path paved through mistakes, failures, and suppressed pages. Acknowledging these facts does not diminish the feat of those who fought, but makes our understanding of the past deeper and more honest. It is a reminder that behind every arrow on a map stand living people with their fears, hopes, and destinies, which cannot simply be erased from memory for the sake of a beautiful myth. The resonance of those events is also felt in how long official historiography avoided the details of Polar Star. In the decades that followed the end of the conflict, an image of an infallible command was created, where every failure was presented either as a deliberate diversionary maneuver or simply ignored. This led to the feat of thousands of people who fought in the forests near Staraya Russa and Demyansk being treated as if it were second-rate compared to the heroes of Stalingrad or the Battle of Kursk. However, it is precisely such unsuccessful operations that show the true price of freedom and the incredible burden that fell on the shoulders of an entire generation. The lesson here is the need for critical thinking and respect for the truth, however bitter it may be. Modern society must value not only the gleam of medals, but also the mournful silence of forgotten battlefields, where every step was taken with immense difficulty. Returning to those February twilight hours with which our story began, we can see in them not just the start of a military operation, but a metaphor for the human striving for the impossible. That soldier in the trench, listening to the rumble of artillery, was part of a colossal design that, like the Polar Star, shone brightly but proved impossibly distant. The ice on the swamps eventually melted, concealing the traces of those dramatic events, but their memory continues to live on, demanding our reflection and acknowledgement. Polar Star did not become a triumph, but it became part of the foundation upon which future victory was built, a foundation mixed with blood, sweat, and the bitter experience of defeats. And in this cyclical return to origins, we find a deeper understanding of what it means to be human in the maelstrom of great and terrible events, where every choice matters and every forgetting is a loss of a part of our common soul. Today, as we look at the forest-grown craters and abandoned villages of the Northwest, we realize that the history of Operation Polar Star is a story of the limits of human capabilities and of the strength of spirit that manifests itself even where hope seems lost. This is a narrative of how wisdom is born from the ashes of failures, and how important it is to remember everyone who remained in those snows, regardless of how successfully the arrows on the general's maps aligned. Silencing the truth only distances us from a true understanding of the past, while an honest look at events allows us to truly appreciate the scale of the feat and the depth of the tragedy of those years. May this story serve as a reminder that the light of truth will always break through the fog of myths, just as the true polar star always finds its place in the night sky, guiding those who are ready to face the truth. Continuing to reflect on the significance of these events, it is worth noting how technical and tactical miscalculations were transformed into subsequent successes. The experience gained in 1943 became a catalyst for changes in the training of officers. It was realized that rigid, centralized planning without considering local initiative often leads to disaster. Commanders began to learn to act in conditions of uncertainty, which later brilliantly manifested itself in the operations of 1944. Thus, The failure of Polar Star became a kind of school of survival and adaptation for the entire military machine. This once again confirms the idea that there are no useless events in history. Each of them contributes to the overall picture, even if at first glance it seems like a meaningless waste of resources. In addition, one cannot forget about the ideological aspect that accompanied the operation. In conditions of total confrontation, the state machine needed constant replenishment of positive news. When reality did not meet expectations, there was a temptation to adjust this reality in reports. This created a dangerous precedent where the highest leadership received distorted information, which, in turn, led to new erroneous decisions. The struggle for the veracity of reports and the adequacy of situation assessment became no less important a front than the battles on the battlefields. And it was precisely those who found the courage to tell the truth about the state of affairs who ultimately contributed to the achievement of the final goal. Ultimately, Operation Polar Star remains in our memory as a complex, multifaceted symbol. It is a symbol of daring conception, the harshness of nature, the bitterness of losses, and the importance of historical truth. We return to it not to condemn or belittle anyone's merits, but to restore justice to those who performed their duty in impossible conditions. Their sacrifice was not in vain, as every day of struggle in the northern direction drew enemy forces away from other sectors of the front, contributing to the overall exhaustion of the enemy. And in this sense, even the offensive, ingloriously melted in the snows, made its invaluable contribution to the future peace. Concluding this journey through the pages of forgotten history, we once again find ourselves facing the eternity preserved in the forests and swamps of the Northwest. Time inexorably smooths out the scars on the earth, but it should not smooth out the acuity of our perception. Every name, every date spoken in words brings us back to the reality of that time, making it closer and more understandable. History is a living organism, and our attention to its dark spots makes us wiser and more responsible for the future. May the memory of Operation Polar Star be not a burden, but a light that helps to distinguish true greatness in the series of everyday battles and great achievements. When we analyze Georgy Zhukov's actions during this period, we see a man at the peak of his power, yet simultaneously a hostage to his own reputation. Only victories were expected of him, and this pressure could not but affect the decisions made. Perhaps this is where the reason for the excessive rigidity with which clearly unfeasible plans were pushed through lies. Understanding the psychology of a leader in such moments helps us to see historical figures not as bronze statues, but as living people capable of mistakes and deep internal struggles. This makes history more human, allowing us to empathize with the participants of events on a deeper, personal level. It is also interesting to consider how the enemy perceived these events. In the memoirs of German generals, the Demyansk salient is often described as a zone of constant crisis, where every day could be the last. The fact that they managed to escape and avoid encirclement was perceived by them as a miracle. But in reality, it was the result of sober calculation and timely abandonment of unnecessary territories. This juxtaposition, the Soviet desire to capture at all costs and the German desire to withdraw in time, creates a unique strategic dialogue, the study of which is extremely important for understanding the logic of that wartime. Thus, our immersion in the details of one seemingly unsuccessful operation opens up a whole universe of meanings and lessons before us. We see how politics, strategy, psychology, and simple human resilience are intertwined. We learn to appreciate honesty in describing the past and to understand that true victory is often forged in moments of the most severe trials and failures. Polaris continues to shine on us from the past, reminding us that every episode of history deserves to be told and understood in all its fullness and complexity. Throughout the operation, thousands of soldiers showed incredible ingenuity in attempts to overcome natural obstacles. Stories of how heavy guns were manually dragged through swamps or how makeshift bridges were built from available materials are striking. This was a war not only of technologies, but also of human resourcefulness, the ability to adapt to the most hostile conditions. These everyday details, often overlooked in official chronicles, actually form the fabric of history, giving it volume and authenticity. Ideologically, the clash near Staraya Russa showed that faith in the infallibility of orders from above can be ruinous. The development of a feedback system within the army, where the opinions of frontline officers began to be taken into account during planning, became one of the most important ideological achievements derived from this experience. The transition from blind obedience to conscious interaction became an important step in the evolution of the entire management structure, which ultimately ensured a turning point in the course of the entire global confrontation. Reflecting on the resonance of these events, we understand that history does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, but it requires us to be able to draw conclusions. Why did a plan that looked flawless on paper fail in reality? The answer to this question lies in the need for a balance between ambitions and capabilities, between theory and practice. This lesson is relevant even today, in any sphere of human activity where large-scale goals require careful preparation and consideration of the smallest details. We conclude our narrative where we began, on the snow-covered expanses where the fate of the northern region was once decided. Now these places are quiet and peaceful, but if you listen carefully, you can catch echoes of that time. Operation Polaris is not just a chapter in a history textbook. It is a living lesson in courage, honesty, and the pursuit of light, even on the darkest night. We remember, we analyze, we understand, and therein lies our connection with those who moved forward under the cold light of the North Star in February 1943. Each time we return to this topic, we discover new facets of heroism and tragedy. It is important to understand that suppressing failures is not a way to protect the country's honor, but a way to devalue the sacrifices of those who participated in them. True honor lies in the ability to acknowledge mistakes and learn from them, while maintaining deep respect for every participant in the events. The history of Operation Polar Star teaches us precisely this: the courage to face the truth and to value human life above any strategic schemes. Expanding on the importance of logistics, it is worth mentioning that it was after this experience that the mass construction of railways and the improvement of supplies to the northern fronts began. The command realized that without a reliable rear, any offensive was doomed. These infrastructural changes played a key role in the final lifting of the blockade of Leningrad a year later. Thus, even failure bore fruit, becoming an impetus for systemic improvements that ultimately led to success. In the context of modern perception, Operation Polar Star reminds us of the importance of maintaining objectivity in a world where information often becomes a tool of manipulation. Studying primary sources, eyewitness accounts, and archival documents allows us to reconstruct the real picture of events, free from the layers of later mythology. This is our duty to the past and the guarantee of our future as a society capable of learning from its mistakes. We see how the destinies of people and entire nations were forged in the crucible of war. Operation Polar Star, with all its contradictions and losses, remains an important element of this process. It was an attempt to do the impossible, which, although not entirely successful, showed the whole world an indomitable will to victory. And this will, ultimately, proved stronger than any obstacles, becoming the guiding light that led to the final conclusion of the global conflict. In the concluding chord of our research, we urge everyone not just to consume information, but to pass it through their heart and mind. The history of Operation Polar Star is not a dry report. It is a living testimony to struggle and hope. May it inspire us to honesty, compassion, and the pursuit of truth in our own lives. And may the light of that distant polar star remind us that, even in the most difficult times, we are not alone, as long as our memory and our striving for understanding are alive. Looking back, we can say with confidence that every participant in those events, every soldier and officer, made their unique contribution to the common cause. Their efforts, however fruitless they may have seemed at the time, created the critical mass that ultimately broke the enemy's resistance. The Polar Star of 1943 did not fade. It transformed into the light of victory that we honor to this day, striving to be worthy of the memory of those who moved forward, no matter what. Concluding this text, we return to the image of silence over the swamps. But now, it is not the silence of waiting, but the silence of memory. A silence in which the voices of the past are heard, calling us to wisdom and humanity. May this silence be a source of strength and inspiration for us, helping us build a world where the grandeur of goals will never justify the oblivion of human destinies.